Hey there everyone, hope you're all well. I'm jumping in here before the episode begins to give you all a fair warning. This episode will likely be one of my more disturbing ones compared to others I've done in the past and may not be suitable for everyone to listen to. There will be talk of gruesome murder, incest, and cannibalism, so it's certainly a touchy subject we're delving into today. And unfortunately, at very few points in this episode are these sorts of topics not discussed. So there will be really no skipping ahead if you want to miss certain parts. If any of these topics do disturb you, or if you faint or get queasy easily, I would recommend not listening to this episode as it can get quite horrific. Like I said, this episode will be a bit different than my usual episodes due to the content in it, and I've been wanting to do this subject for a very long time and decided to start off the year with a strong note. So if you're wondering just how graphic and scary things will get, I'd say maybe listen to the first 10 minutes or so of this episode to determine if the episode would be suitable for any younger listeners out there. But as always, I will leave it up to you to make that judgment. I truly hope those of you who do end up listening to this episode all the way through really enjoy it. I think it has the potential to keep some of you up at night. And so with that warning out of the way, let's begin the show. You could feel it in the coastal winds, people would say. Something had befouled the countryside. A poison had set in, descending onto those who dared journey through the fog-enveloped mountain passes or through the lonely wooded roads. Evil was afoot, preying both on the innocent and on the guilty. It was a warning that first started out as a whisper, echoing through the caverns of ears of those who granted the word's access. However, it wasn't long before those gentle breaths grew into a violent hurricane of rumors. People were disappearing at an alarming rate. At first, it was believed bandits had settled into the countryside, robbing, then killing their victims. But after the number of loss grew into the tens, then steadily into the hundreds, did people realize the situation was far more concerning than they had originally believed. The soft leaves on the trees and blades of grass along the roads had lost their color, replaced by a thick layer of dark crimson as far as the eye could see. It wasn't until an army of fishermen along the rocky coast began discovering thousands of discarded human bones with teeth marks gnawed deeply into them, littering the sandy beaches, and severed limbs bobbing up and down along the crashing waves, did the entire country of Scotland fully realize that monsters were real, and they lived in the hills. Welcome back to another episode on the Moonlight Lore podcast. I'm your host, Jordan Hopkins, and this is the gruesome legend of Scotland's boogeyman, Sawney Bean. Let's take a moment and reach into your mind to imagine this. It's the middle of the 16th century, and you and your family are making your way by horse and carriage to visit some relatives somewhere deep in the Highlands. The journey is long and strenuous, but worth it, you think to yourself, once you see your extended family again. Provisions were likely brought along in the wagons, likely to help sustain you for the day's worth of traveling you've been doing. Maybe you have a few weapons to help defend yourselves from the packs of ravenous wolves or the occasional brave highwayman or two. But the journey has been relatively quiet, almost peaceful, almost as if the normal dangers of the world knew to keep away for some reason. Brushing this thought off, you continue along a darkened path, when all of a sudden you realize the wind in the trees has gone down. The birds have ceased singing. You wonder to yourself why the forest has gone dead. As the others in your party begin to realize this as well and turn around to look, a faint noise catches your ear. Everyone in the party hears it too. You aren't sure what exactly it is that could be making such a peculiar sound, but it's enough to force you to draw back on the reins of your horse to listen carefully. It sounds like screaming, but it's not quite clear as to which direction it's coming from. The gnarled branches of the trees do well to obstruct any view you might have had, so you are forced to rely on your sense of hearing to determine which direction the blood-curdling yells are emanating from. Suddenly, though, another one breaks the silence coming from behind you. Then a third echoing up ahead. The demonic bellowing is surrounding you, obviously coming from a multitude of different sources. You rush to arm yourself with whatever weapon you had brought along with you. An axe, a single-shot rifle perhaps. Every direction is calling for your attention, but not one in particular gives any hint as to where you should focus upon. You know you must help defend your family and the convoy, but you don't know how. A crude axe is flung from the darkness, chopping into the wood of your wagon, narrowly hitting you as you try to see its origin. The darkness beyond the trees does well in hiding the attackers, but you could have sworn you saw a pair of horrific shadows ducking behind the old wooden trunks. You're about to investigate when a scream is heard off to your right. Your spouse is suddenly staring at you wide-eyed, their breath leaking from their bleeding mouth. They collapse to their knees to reveal a small figure behind them holding a sharpened knife, just as bloodstained as their body. Briefly puzzled, you aren't sure what you're looking at. Is that a human? An animal? A demon? You raise your rifle to take aim at it. Whatever it was going to pay for what it had done. But before you're able to take a shot, your vision flashes white as something hard clubs you on the back of your head. The screams grow louder now as you fall to the forest floor, your family witnessing the monsters emerging from the woods joining the cacophony of cries. You fall face first into the dirt, colliding with the hard ground below, unable to move, dancing on the tightrope between consciousness and sleep. Closing your eyes for a second, you feel a warm sensation pour down the back of your head towards your face. You think first perhaps it's sweat, but sweat isn't quite that warm. Your eyes reopen to see a crimson liquid leaking past your sockets and down your nose, forming a pool around your face. Another familiar scream catches your attention. You turn your head slightly to witness your young daughter fleeing down the path, chased by bizarre, blurry shapes, before she trips and is pounced upon. You still aren't sure what they are, only that they are cutting down those you love. But you can't stop it. There are far too many of them rushing around you, some on 2 legs, others on all 4s. The others aren't fast enough to escape, and the sinking feeling of being unable to save them is clawing at your mind, scratching the insides of your skull. You decide to lay still, hoping these manic marauders won't discover your deception, that they'll believe you are dead and leave you alone. When the last of the crying, hollering, and sounds of hacking finally ends, you realize that you may have just lost your opportunity to save yourself, to escape. Still trying not to move, a group of dirty, strong hands grasp at your limp body and haul you into your wagon. Since you had fallen first and hadn't run, you were the first body loaded up. Then the crushing weight of your family, your spouse, your son, your daughter, your brothers and sisters, are all flung on top of you, stacked and ready to be transported. Suffocating beneath the weight of the corpses, you aren't sure if you're blacking out from either the horrific experience or the immense blood loss from the wound on the back of your head. You don't know where they are taking you, and you run out of time to ponder it as your eyes slowly drift to black and you fall unconscious. Unfortunately, the ordeal isn't over for you as you suddenly awake from your deep sleep. The taste of stale, salty air on your lips and tongue. The smell of something foul lingering in the air, penetrating and burning your sinuses. Trying to move, you find your hands are bound behind your back, tied up to a wooden beam. Delirious and your vision still blurry, you try to make out where you are, what kind of environment these kidnappers had brought you to. The only light is the soft glow of dying embers of a fire not far off, revealing darkened shadows and shapes moving about the room. Realizing you're in a cave, you tug at your restraints even more, shifting slightly, making more noise than you should be. Someone near the fire lets out a soft release of air from their lungs that draws your attention. The embers glow brighter, coming back to life. The redness of the small flames bring back more light, revealing the small reflection of yellow orbs floating all around the cavernous dungeon. You realize quickly these are animalistic eyes, demonic eyes, the eyes of your captors, revealing to you a crazed hunger that has yet to be filled. As the fire continues to grow, their features are revealed. Blood-soaked, skeletal, pale. They appear to be monsters, but there is no doubt they were once human. You watch in horror as most of them seem to grin with teeth sharp enough to tear into the hide of a cow, yet their attention is drawn onto you, their prey. As they lick their blood-stained lips clean from the feast they had just consumed, you watch in complete helpless terror as the small army descends onto you, hungry for seconds. Now, you may believe this tale was a horrific nightmare born from the disturbed mind of a podcaster, but thankfully for me, this is not the whole case. This was reality for hundreds and hundreds of unfortunate people who managed to find themselves in the clutches of the Sawney Bean cannibal horde. For 25 long years, regular people like you and me would disappear after being ambushed by the clan, doomed to a fate that would put most horror movies to shame. Funnily enough, though, the origin of the legend didn't start out as horrific as I had previously painted for you. Instead, it actually begins quite peaceful and humble, with the life of a young farm boy who would happen to grow into the monster. So, like we always like to do concerning the best of legends, let's harken back to the beginning and see what life was like for a young Sawney Bean before he notoriously grew into Scotland's most feared boogeyman. As legend would have it, Alexander Bean was born and raised into a lower-class family in the county of East Lothian, roughly 15 kilometers from Edinburgh in the early 16th century. His parents worked day in and day out trimming hedges and digging ditches to get by. Certainly not the most glamorous life, but this was their livelihood and they found steady pay in it. Alexander was brought up in this backbreaking world and found himself longing for more. He dreamed of a life where manual labor was not his only way of survival. The pitiful pay that came with it was not worth exchanging his health and youthfulness for. He wanted more, craved excitement, longed for adventure. Of course, his parents were quite against this boyish dream he constantly found himself in. They needed his help with work and instructed him to abandon his hopes for the future and focus on the present. At such a young age, the bitterness that formed deep inside the young man grew beyond what was normal. It festered in him, begging to be set loose. The only relief he felt was the overwhelming sensation of true love. However, his parents were strictly against this as well, due to who he chose to devote his heart to. A young woman, Black Angus Dougal, a woman who shared Alexander's hatred for the world after being labeled as a witch due to her cruel and violent temper, and inadvertently both of them were shunned by the community they were a part of. By allowing her to capture his heart, Alexander's destiny was both corrupted and sealed. Despite the displeasure their parents vocalized of the two's union, they continued to date for months on end, going about life idly wondering what was in store for them. But the constant badgering from his parents forced Alexander to take the necessary steps towards his destiny. He decided to quit the family business. A life of hard labor was not one he was interested in pursuing, so he and Black Angus fled from the only home they had ever known, heading westward towards the coast. Although eloping and becoming free from the shackles of their old lives and civil society, this match made in hell hit a bit of a problem. As it turns out, abandoning a life of honest work and respectable living comes at a great cost, and the two of them quickly found themselves without a coin to their name. This circumstance, however, was not an issue to them as it normally would be for anyone else, because as one could expect, their unruly personalities mixed with their lack of moral consciousness made the act of robbing and killing others to make ends meet quite easy for them. Unsurprisingly, the brutality they dished out onto others sparked a bit of joy in their black hearts, because they also found that while the practice of being highway robbers was quite lucrative, they also found they quite enjoyed it and were also quite efficient at it. This would inevitably lead to a string of unsolved murders and robberies throughout the southwest of Scotland as the two slowly made their way to their forever home, a coastal cave in the County Galloway, southwest Scotland. By this time, reports of violent attacks being unleashed onto the public by a pair of vicious marauders began floating around, and people thought it nothing more than just a new group of highwaymen who had decided to set up shop in the area. It was nothing new, and people believed it would be dealt with swiftly by the authorities. However, Alexander and Black Agnes were tricky. They rarely left any survivors after their ambushes, and any who did manage to get away were never able to give a proper description of their attackers, so the pair were left relatively unchecked. But with the heightened alert the county was now on, it made traveling into towns and villages near impossible without drawing suspicion. Remember, these two robbed people of their valuables and lived off the grid in the wild. They were hardly ever in presentable attire, even as peasants, simply because their clothing was often filthy or stained with blood, and regardless of what people might think of the two, they weren't incompetent. They knew if they tried traveling into a populated area as newcomers who were trying to sell goods that had been stolen, there could have been a chance someone would recognize the stolen merchandise and their schemes would be swiftly brought to an end. So instead of making a living by selling their stolen goods for coin, which would have brought them closer to living a relatively normal life with the bare minimum of supplies, they instead decided it was best if they simply held on to the items they would accumulate from their robberies by stashing them in their hidden hideout deep underground. And of course, as it would inevitably happen, as there was often very little to do in their coastal hideout, the Beans eventually started having children. With the lack of societal comforts at their doorstep and the overwhelming negative moral influence of their parents, these children more or less grew up as complete copies of both Alexander and Black Angus, much to their parents' delight, because this meant they would eventually have more help when it came to attacking travelers or hauling the stolen goods back home. Unfortunately for those being attacked on the road, this also meant Alexander had more than just two mouths to feed now, and the low quantity of rations travelers would often carry on them wouldn't be enough to sustain the whole brood. This is truly when things began to take a more sinister turn, and when Sawney Bean's influence began to take hold of the region. To satisfy his starving, cave-dwelling family, Alexander had the briefest of thoughts, and realized a solution to overcome his problem was far more simple than he had initially believed. On his next raid, the man decided to hack off some of the limbs belonging to those he killed. He took great consideration on what he thought he should bring back. Children were smaller, so he could potentially drag the entire body back home with him, but the adults were larger and would provide them with the food they needed to feed everyone. Eventually, like a child trying to decide which chocolate bar they wanted from the store, Sawney Bean decided he should just bring home a little bit of both. Black Angus would be home, rearing their feral children until her husband returned with the goods from his shopping list. And as it would turn out, she had a natural talent for cooking. While Sawney would remain outside, beyond the mouth of their cave, chopping up portions of the mangled limbs he had brought home, Black Angus would get to work hauling the cut pieces in, and pickled, salted, or boiled them into a stew that her family would feast upon for the coming days. As the years passed on, their children continued the family business with their parents, raiding, kidnapping, and killing those who wandered too close to their lair. This meant, not before long, they had an excess amount of food. Even though they became monsters who feasted on the flesh of humans, they could still only eat so much. Eventually, the pieces of flesh that had become so rotten while waiting to be consumed that even the Beans couldn't bear the thought of eating them, they decided to be rid of them by simply tossing them out into the ocean. This meant discarded legs, arms, fingers, toes, ears, you name it, all ended up either washing ashore or becoming trapped in fishermen's nets far down the coast. This began sparking some serious debate among the villages and towns in the area, with some believing literal monsters were roaming the wilds. Little did they know, they weren't that far off from the truth. Everyone had known travelers in the region would go lost now and then, and most believed it was either by accident or the result of attacks drawn out by bandits. But now that severed limbs and human flesh with obvious teeth marks gnawed into the bones were being discovered, it quickly became a situation nobody was even remotely prepared for. The trouble was, they had no idea who or what it was that was committing these horrendous crimes. Nobody had ever seen the culprits and lived to tell the tale, so unfortunately there were no leads that the authorities at the time could necessarily follow. All they could do was routine patrols in the area. In the meantime, while panic was slowly swallowing the country, the Beans continued swallowing the meat of those they captured. By this time, many of their children had grown old enough to join their father and mother on their raids, as well as helping ensure the Bean bloodline would continue. By following in the footsteps of many royal families around the world, The Bean sons and daughters would eventually become the Bean husbands and wives, and with these unsettling unions, more children would be brought into the picture, inbred and bred to join their monstrous family. Eventually, the group found that their numbers had increased exponentially over the years, with Alexander and Black Agnes producing 6 daughters and 8 sons, who then also later produced 14 daughters and 18 sons of their own, creating a literal small army of cannibals. Now, this incessant breeding only did more to drive the Bean clan to expand their operations, striking and attacking hundreds traveling on the roadways. They killed and dismembered so many people over the course of their 25-year reign that they actually tanked the local economy. Nobody wanted to travel the roads anymore. Villages and towns eventually became deserted because they were unable to restock their supplies, and there was very little doubt that once this mysterious group of marauders hit a certain size in regards to their numbers, they could certainly resort to storming villages, unimpeded by the local authorities who would be vastly outnumbered. Again, at this time, very few knew who these violent killers were. Nobody could have suspected they were a family of inbred cannibals. Whole companies of soldiers and officers were tasked with finding those responsible for the attacks, but they had no idea who they were or where to even begin searching for them. The Bean clan remained well hidden, and despite years of becoming insane, they were either extremely lucky or extremely smart, because the coastal cave they called their home was unlike what many would picture. It faced towards the open sea, so unless you knew where the opening was among the cracks and crags of jutting rocks, you weren't going to necessarily find it all too easily unless you already knew it was there. Especially when the tide came rolling in, which it would do every day. The water would rise up, completely obscuring the entrance of their hideout, allowing a safe and secure mile-long underground air pocket to form where the family would live. Their cave was deep enough with sprawling tunnels leading to even deeper underground cavernous rooms, which allowed the family to spread out a bit and store their stolen goods. But most importantly, if anyone did happen to stumble upon the cave, to them it would seem just like any other normal hole in the ground. In all sense of the word, their hideout was perfect. With their very existence essentially being kept secret from the world, the continuing crimes that had been occurring throughout the countryside for years was putting pressure on the authorities to discover the culprits. Unsurprisingly, due process in the 16th century was not necessarily the most reliable, and to add to the total death count in this story, many innocent people were sentenced to death on the loosely accused suspicion that they had something to do with the cannibalistic murders, even though nobody did, or ever admitted to the accusations put forward onto them. This only encouraged those who were still left in the county to board up shop and leave the area when they still had the chance. If you weren't murdered, dismembered, and eaten by a cannibal in the woods, then you'd be accused of dealing out such crimes and swiftly put to death. It didn't matter if you were a farmer, innkeeper, or even a visitor. Everyone was pointing fingers at those who displayed any sort of odd behavior at any time. In a word, the whole county was nearly depopulated. The authorities, seeming unable to put a stop to the mass murders, eventually did cease the execution of the innocent folks who were accused, but then the situation continued to spiral out of control for many in County Galloway, as the Sawney Bean clan were left unchecked for years to come. It wasn't until it neared a quarter of a century would things start to change. By pure coincidence, a man and woman were passing through the countryside, and unbeknownst to them, they had wandered straight into the Bean family's territory. The two of them were in high spirits after having recently just departed from attending a nearby fair, and found each other's company to be quite the distraction as they rode through the deadly silent woods. Either they were too oblivious to the danger lurking in the shadows, or the Sawney Bean family had grown so skilled in the art of stealth, but the pair managed to ride their horses directly into the family's trap. Similar to how I described at the beginning of the episode, the snap of a few branches caused the couple to halt their horses in the dead center of the road, likely wondering to themselves what sort of beast lurked beyond their line of sight. The man, wanting to both prove himself and impress his partner, steered his horse closer to the edge of the path to garner a closer view of the animal he believed was stalking them. As he peered out past the dark, gnarled branches of the trees separating him from his suspected prey, a sharp gasp from behind drew his attention back to his partner. She was staring down the path, wide-eyed and mouth agape. She whispers to the man that she could have sworn she had seen a shadow of a hideous man dart across the road in front of them. This drew the brave man back closer to his woman, hoping to spot what she had claimed to have seen as well, and also to protect her if the worst were to occur. As it would turn out, his instinct and gut feeling served him well, because not a moment after he mentioned perhaps they should start moving again, an animalistic scream that sounded both demonic and human echoed out of the woods, piercing their ears, causing both to jump with a start. Before they realized it, from every direction the shadowy, deranged figures of 30 to 40 people burst from the wilderness, brandishing all sorts of weapons at their disposal. Clubs, axes, and knives were thrusted at the pair of riders. In defense of this abnormal attack, the man also happened to be well armed and quite the duelist himself. With a pistol in one hand and his sword in the other, the man fought off his attackers, narrowly missing the objects hurled at him from a distance as he fought tooth and nail against the horde of bloodthirsty monsters reaching up for him. The woman, however, was not so skilled in the art of combat. As her partner was too occupied fighting off the group surrounding him and his horse, the same was happening to her. However, she wasn't faring nearly as well. With no weapons to defend herself with, she was easily pulled down from her horse and dragged into the dirt, kicking and screaming for help. Like a pack of feral dogs that had been waiting to pounce on an injured cat, the Sawney Bean clan jumped her, tearing at her clothes and savagely beating her with their fists. It wasn't long before the knives were drawn, and before the man, still on his horse, even realized it, his beloved was swiftly cut to pieces, still screaming for help. As legend would have it, the sight of the blood glistening in the moonlight drove the family into a frenzy, feasting on pieces of flesh and drowning their throats with the thick liquid as if it were wine. They hacked the woman's hands and feet apart while she was still alive, begging to be put out of her misery. This dreadful spectacle, however, only invigorated the man's fighting spirit, as the cries of his love were slowly silenced, drowned out by the horrific sounds of the clan devouring her entrails. He defended himself with as much skill and strength he could muster, until he was finally backed up against a tree, surrounded on all sides by the grinning, blood-dripping faces of the cannibal clan. It looked as though his life was about to come to a brutally abrupt end as the members of the family closed in. But then suddenly, a faint orange glow began to appear off in the distance, the light growing more bold by the second. Rescue had come. A large group of 20 to 30 villagers who had also been at the same fair had heard the commotion coming from the wooded path up ahead and knew what had befallen the couple the moment they heard the gunfire. The army of carnival patrons hooped and hollered, with their pitchforks and swords reaching for the sky as their torches burned away the darkness. The Sawney Bean family were caught off guard. In their 25-year reign, it was the first time they were caught, and the first time they would leave behind a survivor. Invigorated once more by his quickly approaching backup, the man found a new burst of adrenaline coursing through his veins, and the fight was back on. The Bean family were not talented fighters. Their means of attack relied solely on their ability to ambush and overwhelm with numbers, but now the scales had been tipped, and they were effectively outmatched. Calling for a retreat, the clan sprinted from the scene, abandoning the body of the slain woman and the out-of-breath man who was nearly their next victim. The ragtag company of fighters finally made it to the battlefield, and were stunned to find the sight before them. They asked what had happened, to which the man told them every last detail, describing their attackers and which direction they fled towards. Finally, somebody managed to survive. They knew they couldn't waste this opportunity. The company of townsfolk escorted the exhausted man from the forest and straight to Glasgow with the news of the attack. Legend would say when the man arrived at the city, he requested a personal audience with King James, who was absolutely horrified to hear crimes like this had been and currently was still occurring under his reign. He wouldn't stand for such evil to be inhabiting his lands, preying on his people. So he ordered a hunting party of 400 men to be formed, and His Majesty himself would accompany the army to ensure this evil was ended. With the man as their guide, King James and his 400 soldiers were taken back to the scene of the attack, where they quickly began their search, surveying every rock and thicket for any and all clues that could point them in the direction of where this band of cannibals resided. With 100 bloodhounds leading the army down to the coast, the lonely, inconspicuous cave where the Beans called home was discovered. But believing no such group of 30 to 50 people could live in such a dark, cramped environment, the hunters were about to press on. If it weren't for the bloodhounds insisting the scent they were following led them into the dark, cramped cave, it could have been possible the Bean clan would have been allowed to continue their appalling crimes. But King James ordered his men into the cave, trusting in the noses of his canine companions. Upon first light of their torches, The horrors the soldiers encountered inside were unlike anything anyone should ever have seen. The rock walls and floors were stained with a crusty dark red color, likely caused by the 1,000 corpses that had passed through the place. Stolen goods were piled everywhere. Storage barrels with pickled legs and arms sat against a distant wall. A large boiling pot with a thick broth of bones sat stewing atop a dying fire. Entire corpses, men, women, and children, were hung like dried beef near the ceiling. Massive mounds of body parts piled into a corner, and the stench of the place was reportedly comparable to death itself, having died 1,000 deaths. This home of horrors had everything you could possibly think of and so much more of what you couldn't. And as the vast brigade set to work exploring further through the system that delved deeper into the depths of the earth, the distant sounds of movement could be heard echoing off the wet rock walls of the tunnels. There, cowering in the back of the cave, was Alexander Bean and his family. The reality of knowing their end was soon at hand, casting over each and every one of their faces at the first sight of the soldiers. Knowing they were vastly outnumbered, the Bean clan surrendered immediately, their hands bound together in shackles, and marched out of the cave by the soldiers. There on the beach, King James ordered every piece of flesh to be buried in the sands, hoping to give the victims a chance at peace once their bodies were laid to rest. With this terrible family now captured, King James led them and his army back to Edinburgh, where all 48 members of the Sawney Bean clan would find their journey's end. King James gave the order to rid the earth of such vile creatures who were nothing more than enemies of mankind. Without trial, each member of the Sawney Bean clan was sentenced to punishment in a befitting manner of the time. The men of the family had their members cut off, their hands and feet severed to allow them to bleed to death. Their bodies were then burned in one giant pyre of fire, while the women and children were forced to watch. Upon the last of the men being burned, the women and children were then also tossed upon the flames while still alive. All the while they continued to curse and vent at their captors, refusing to repent for their inhumane crimes until the final scream was wholly swallowed up by the roaring blaze of the fire. So, I'm sorry for sharing such a shocking and horrendous tale. It's truly one of the more disturbing ones I think I have ever researched and shared with anyone. And with that being said, maybe you can take a breath of relief knowing the following information. That the legend of Sawney Bean and his cannibal family is widely disputed on if it was ever at all true or not. After hearing the story, we can think to ourselves, how could anything so disturbing and that sinister ever have happened in human history? Well, unfortunately, human history is just chock full of horrific tales varying from all sorts of cultures and time periods. Humans are certainly capable of more than the worst of what we can think of. But thankfully, in this case, it's likely the Sawney Bean cannibal legend is one that likely never happened, and if it did, then certainly not to the extent of how it's told nowadays. There are many historians and authors who have delved deep into the legend, and there is a very good theory that the truth of the origin of the legend comes from English propaganda against the Scottish nation back in the 15th and 16th centuries. According to prolific author and researcher Ronald Holmes, he states, "It is highly indicative that the legend of Sawney Bean was published only in England during the first 100 years of its existence in print. Since it combined a sense of wonder, degradation of a traditional enemy, and so many well-known aspects of folktale and history, it must have been something of a bestseller." Accusations of cannibalism as a weapon of propaganda is very old indeed, and was used during this period. It was used during the Great Rebellion in England and was to be used again against the French during the Revolution. Against this background, it may be believed that the legend of Sawney Bean was used as anti-Scottish propaganda. If so, it seemed to have some success, for the evidence shows that some people believe that the Scots ate children during the 1745 rebellion. However, Ronald Holmes provides no evidence to support this theory or claim. But it is entirely possible the legend derives from the English, hoping to persuade the public into believing the Scots were nothing more than barbarians in the north. The first mention of the Bean clan was printed in the early 1700s, then later perpetuated in the 18th century once it garnered popularity after two influential events, the suppression of the Covenanters and the Jacobite Rebellion. The suppression of the Covenanters refers to the quashing of the 17th century Scottish religious and political movement who supported the Presbyterian Church of Scotland and the ability to practice their own religions freely, and the Jacobite Rising being that of an attempt by Charles Edward Stuart to overthrow the British throne in favor of his house. But after having failed in their attempt to gain support in England ahead of their advance on London, the Jacobite invasion force then retreated back to Scotland. It's believed the legend of the Bean Cannibals was perpetuated propaganda against the Scottish people due to other discovered English propaganda created before these specific events, describing similar legends of cannibals in the Highlands. Additionally, the name itself, Sawney, has its roots tied back to England as well, who used the derogatory name as a smear tactic against the Scots as early as the 1650s. Short for the name Alexander, Sawney became known as a slur defaming anyone of Scottish descent, implying those who are named Sawney are worthless or unintelligent. It's also an interesting note to make that the earliest known record of the Bean legend comes from an edition dated from 1779 from the St. Mary's Aldermary Church in London, England. More editions, slightly changing in detail, can be found in many corners of both England and Scotland as the legend seemed to grow throughout the years. Nobody ever really did have all the facts when it came to the retelling of the story, and the only editions that don't cast the Scottish people in such a grotesque and inhumane light are the ones that were specifically printed in Scotland itself. The hidden allegorical religious teachings of the Sawney Bean story also likely was a major part of the creation of the legend. Many morals and aphorisms are pointed out throughout the tale, such as the sin of sloth. Sawney comes from a hard-working, honest family but chooses a life away from that of his parents, one that is easier and idle. He and his family shunned away civil society and along with it the church. At the time of their deaths, they are cast into the fire and refuse to repent, effectively plotting a path to hell. The robbery and crimes they commit offer no sort of reward. Their cave is filled with the plunder of their raids, but they are still living in squalor like animals. Crime does not pay. With teachings like these, and so many others throughout the story of Sawney Bean, the case becomes more evident that it was created to both belittle an already oppressed group of people, while at the same time teaches that living a life in such a way is not one should strive for. It would seem, to me at the very least, the English likely created and used the propaganda of Sawney Bean to discredit and insult the Scots, like they had done so with so many similar cannibalistic stories in the past, while at the same time encouraging those living under English rule that by separating from the proper morals of both church and country, that there is no life worth living. The Sawney Bean legend is, quite honestly, riddled with obscure information and forgotten facts. For instance, the cave itself that was said to once host the cannibal family is completely lost to us as there are a number of different caves dotting the western coast. But people believe there are two solid options on which cave hosted the family. Benin Cave is the first, which is also known as Snib's Cave in reference to a man named Snib Scott who lived in the cave up until his death in 1983 from hypothermia. It is located north of Ballantrae and in proximity to Benin Head. There is a rock wall and a doorway that blocks the entrance of the cave, but unlike what the story says, the tide does not reach up to its mouth and hides it. It's completely accessible to the public, so if any of my listeners from Scotland wish to check it out, I believe you can do so at any time. Then there's the second cave that lies further north on the coast near the Bay of Balcruchen Port, which is widely considered to be the one that would have hosted the family if the legend was at all true. It is not easily or even entirely accessible during high tide, and it's actually discouraged for anyone to actually go and check it out as it can be very treacherous. But in the 1930s, the Ordnance Survey maps identified this particular one as being the Sawney Bean's Cave. However, many local historians claim this was likely only an error and was probably only ever used by smugglers or transients in the past, not by a large family of ruthless killers. Next, we have to ask ourselves, was there ever really an Alexander Bean who committed these crimes? Well, unfortunately, we simply just don't know for sure. Historians have scoured through the old birth, death, marriage, and will records for quite some time, trying to get to the bottom of who Alexander Bean might have truly been. But the last name Bean can have a plethora of different spellings like B-E-A-N or B-E-A-N-E, or maybe Macbean or Bane. There's just really no telling which name the infamous cannibal of legend had gone by in the 16th century. Plus, the records needed for such a search are quite lacking. There were no census being done during this time, and literacy was still quite scarce. So unfortunately, there's really no clear family tree we could follow that dates back far enough or is filled out enough that we could point to any specific person being our culprit. But I'm sure anyone living today who might have had any kind of family ties to Sawney Bean as their ancestor would probably want that information to remain lost. For the most part, the Sawney Bean legend is certainly a story that goes well beyond what typical folklore seems to offer us in terms of digging for the truth. Because when we break down the legend to its core, there's just not enough information out there to say the cannibal clan of Scotland was ever real. There has never been any real proof of the Beans having operated along the western coast of the country, and any writings about the legends were written years and years after the fact, leaning heavily into it being more frightening folklore and convenient propaganda for the English, if anything. And when we think about it, regardless of what century it was or what available information we have, would the authorities have ever allowed such a methodical killer clan of cannibals to go so unchecked, despite apparently being allowed to disrupt trade routes, effectively disrupting the local economy and putting such a large dent in the population after allegedly eating 1,000 people? To me, it would not seem likely the authorities would stand for such an offensive act to occur over the course of 25 years. That idea just seems a tad ridiculous in my eyes. From the information I've gathered and shared with all of you today, I fully believe the killer cannibal clan led by Sawney Bean was nothing more than folklore and propaganda. And although the legend was likely never true, it still is able to make ripples in our modern day. Horror movie fanatics may recognize this story as being similar to Wes Craven's cult classic, The Hills Have Eyes, a movie about a cannibal family who reside in the Nevada desert who stalk and kill those who drive through the isolating region. There are countless fictional books that follow the same thread as the legend, like L.A. Morris's book titled Flesh Eaters, published in 1979, about a clan roaming the highlands searching for human flesh to consume. And probably without being said, Sawney Bean is one of Scotland's most famous boogeymen to ever exist. Parents or grandparents today who have trouble getting their young children to eat their dinner will sometimes invoke the cannibal's name, stating to their children that if you don't eat your vegetables, Sawney Bean will come in the middle of the night and eat you. It's really interesting how this old folklore has been molded and shaped into what it has become today, a horrific tale that captures the worst humanity has to offer, and allows us a glimpse into what can happen when the evil of the world is allowed to be left unchecked. So, thanks for listening to my episode about the Sawney Bean Cannibal Clan, everyone. If you've made it through to the end, I applaud you and your stomach for being able to handle such a nausea-inducing episode. I know it's certainly a much darker topic than what I usually cover, but I've been wanting to do this for a topic for so long, and I honestly even never knew how bad it was until I had already started mapping it out and how I was going to tell it. And I don't know what this might say about me, but I certainly did try to paint a colorful picture of how gruesome this topic can be. There was a lot in there that I definitely did not need to say or add, but I like being able to practice my creative writing, and I thought this one was the perfect opportunity to freak some people out. If you enjoyed this topic but are wanting to learn more about it, I bought this book titled Sawney Bean, Dissecting the Legend of the Scottish Cannibal by Blaine L. Pardo. I think that's how you say his name. There's so much information in there about how this legend could be true, but mostly it's about breaking down the legend to find if it was at all true or not. Plus, it also goes into different variations of the story and expands on parts of the investigation that I didn't go into myself on this episode. So if you want to learn more about this topic, do go check out that book. If you found this episode as chilling as I did when reading about it, and you have some friends or family who you think might need a good fright, send them over my way and tell them about the show. I know I have some horror fanatics out there listening who have been craving scarier topics to be done, so here's your chance to share what I got for you. And while you're doing that, please consider leaving a 5-star review for the podcast on whatever app you might be listening on. That would be great. It only takes a second to do and goes a tremendous way in helping the show grow. If you are looking for more ways to support the show or are craving a little more content the average person doesn't get, then check out the Moonlight Lore Patreon. For as little as $5 a month, you gain access to all bonus content up there, including episodes the public doesn't get to hear, as well as joining the book club I'm currently starting on there now. Basically, I talk about a certain book in a post, so if you found that you enjoyed a particular topic I've covered, then maybe I can help you find a book that can expand that topic a bit for you. I've realized I read and use a ton of different books for my research for each episode, so I figured this would be some nice extra content for you all over there. I'm not sure what time this episode is going to be going up, honestly, as I'm recording this. It might come up soon, or it might come up at the end of the month, I'm not too sure yet. But at any rate, I should have posted an update on the main feed of what's been going on in my life at the moment and why I've basically been slow to upload. So if you missed that, I'll talk about it here too. Basically, I've been taking on contracts to do narration and voice work for some people, and I just have to dedicate my time to doing those because I'm contractually obligated and also getting paid for it. Whereas I don't necessarily get paid for doing the podcast unless you donate to the Patreon. So for the next little while, the episodes will either be coming out slow or just not at all for a little bit while I focus on other work. Maybe I'll post little tiny episodes here and there just to sustain you guys, but people on the Patreon, you will still get your full episodes each month. So if you can't go without full episodes for a little while, like I said, it's only $5 a month on the Patreon, so go check that out if you want. But this does not mean it's the end of the podcast. I just need to get my ducks in a row here, and I'll be back at making content for you all in no time. I just may be taking a month or two off to focus on my freelance work. But I know you guys understand and are kind enough to wait for good content. So I have to say thank you to all of you so much for being as amazing as you all are. I love doing the podcast, and it will not stop anytime soon, I don't think. But right now, there's just going to be a small break, and I hope this episode can tie you all over for a little bit. In the meantime, everyone, please do take care of yourselves and those around you. As always, keep being your amazing selves, and if anyone has any questions or concerns, as always, feel free to message me on email or on Instagram because I'm still active there, even though if I'm not posting something, I'm still always on there every day. But yeah, I think that's it for this episode. So until you guys hear back from me on Instagram or on the main feed for the podcast here, like I said, take care, and I hope to see you all again soon.